Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever loved someone in secret, knowing that if the truth ever came out, you might lose everything, including them? Margaret Hale knew that fear every single day of her life. She wore a wedding ring on a chain under her dress instead of on her finger, because the man she married could not yet tell the world she was his wife. Tonight, you are going to watch her world almost collapse in front of 200 guests, a ballroom full of candles, and one woman who wanted her gone. Stay until the end, because the moment the Duke finally opens his mouth in that ballroom will give you chills. And when you are done watching, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I would love to say hello to you, and to know just how far our story has traveled. Margaret Hale was not born to live behind doors. She was raised in a small house near the coast, the daughter of a merchant who taught her how to read numbers before he taught her how to dance. When her father's small shipping trade failed, and he died still owing money to men who did not forgive debts, Margaret was left with nothing but his old ledgers and a stubborn will to survive. She met Edmund Ashworth on a rainy afternoon in a bookshop in London, 2 years before this story begins. He was not yet introduced to her as a duke. He was simply a quiet man, asking the shopkeeper for a book on maritime law, and she was the only other customer who could tell him which page he needed. They talked for an hour, then 2. By the time she learned his title, she had already given him something far more dangerous than her attention. She had given him her heart. They married quietly, in a small chapel outside the city, with only a vicar and Edmund's oldest friend as witnesses. It should have been the beginning of a new life. Instead, it became a secret Margaret had to carry alone, because Edmund's mother was gravely ill at the time, and the Duke feared that revealing a wife of no fortune and no title would break whatever strength his mother had left. He asked Margaret to wait. She agreed. Neither of them expected to still be waiting 2 years later, with his mother now gone, and a new kind of danger walking through the front doors of his estate in emerald silk. Margaret had learned the layout of Camden House, the way a prisoner learns the walls of her cell, not because she loved it, but because she needed to know every corner where she could disappear. Tonight she stood just behind the drawing-room door, her fingers curled against the old wood, listening to laughter that was not meant for her ears. Inside, Edmund stood near the fireplace, his shoulders stiff in a way that told her he was uncomfortable, even if his voice stayed calm. Around him sat 3 of London's most talked-about families, each with an unmarried daughter and a mother eager to remind the Duke of it. "You cannot mourn forever, Your Grace," said one of the mothers, her voice syrupy and careful. "A house like this needs a duchess." Margaret closed her eyes. She already was the Duchess. She had been for 2 years, but the word Duchess belonged to a woman who could walk into that room and take a seat, not one who had to hide behind a door with her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of her father's old warning, the one he used to give her when she was small and impatient. "Good things wait for the right season," he used to say, "but they do not wait forever." She was beginning to wonder which one her marriage was. A maid named Ruth found her there minutes later, carrying a tray of cold tea nobody had asked her to remove. Ruth was the only person in the house who knew the truth, because she had been the one to stitch Margaret's wedding gown 2 years earlier in secret, by candlelight, when everyone else believed the 2 of them were simply mending curtains. "You should not be standing here," Ruth whispered. "If Mrs. Pemberton finds you loitering by the family rooms again, she will have questions." "I am not loitering," Margaret said, though her voice shook slightly. "I am listening." "To what? More talk of marriage prospects?" Margaret nodded, and Ruth's face softened with the kind of pity that made Margaret's chest ache more than anger ever could. "He will tell them eventually," Ruth said. "You know he loves you. Loving me and being brave enough to say so in front of all of London are 2 very different things, Ruth." That night, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Edmund found her in the small sitting room she used when she could not sleep. He looked tired, in the way men look tired, when they have spent an entire evening choosing their words instead of speaking freely. They will not stop asking, he said quietly, sitting across from her. My mother's death gave them the opening they wanted. Then give them an answer, Margaret said. Tell them the truth. And if the truth destroys what little standing I have left to protect this estate and everyone who depends on it, the tenants, the staff, even you, Margaret, I am not protecting my pride. I am protecting our future. She wanted to believe him. Most nights, she did. But there were other nights, like tonight, when the waiting felt less like patience and more like erasure, as though the longer she stayed hidden, the more the world forgot she existed at all. Lady Constance Whitmore arrived at Camden House 3 days later with 6 trunks, a French maid, and an invitation that Edmund's late mother had extended almost a year earlier, before either of them could have guessed how the timing would land. Constance was recently widowed, her husband a viscount who had left her a title but very little money, and she had decided, with the practical coldness of someone raised to see marriage as a transaction, that the young Duke of Camden was her best remaining option in all of England. She did not ask permission to stay. She simply stayed, filling the guest wing with her belongings and her opinions, and within a week, she had rearranged the household staff's schedules, criticized the choice of curtains in the East Hall, and set her attention firmly on a woman she assumed was nothing more than a housekeeper's assistant with an oddly refined way of speaking. You, Constance said one afternoon, finding Margaret arranging flowers in the hall. What is your position here? I help with the household accounts, my lady, Margaret answered carefully. Constance studied her, the way one studies a piece of furniture, deciding whether it is worth keeping. You have the bearing of someone who thinks she is above her station. Be careful with that. Men like the Duke do not marry women who forget their place. Margaret said nothing. She had learned, over 2 years of hiding, that silence was often the safest answer. But Constance was not finished. Over the following weeks, she began a quiet campaign that never quite crossed into open cruelty, which made it harder to fight. She would ask for tasks to be redone for no reason. She would comment, within Margaret's hearing, on how strange it was that a mere assistant dined so late and so often near the family wing. She would smile at Margaret in front of the other staff, then whisper something unkind the moment they were alone. Edmund noticed none of it at first, because Constance was careful never to perform for him. She performed for everyone else, building a story about Margaret, one small comment at a time, the way water shapes stone, not with force, but with patience. It was Ruth who finally brought it to Margaret's attention in full. She is asking questions about your family, your father's business, where you came from before Camden House, Ruth said. She asked Mr. Feathers in the records room for old shipping documents from the southern coast. Margaret's stomach turned cold. Her father's failed shipping trade was the one piece of her past she had never fully explained, even to Edmund, not because she was ashamed of her father, but because the details of his final years were more painful than she had ever let herself examine. Why would she want those records? Margaret asked. Ruth's expression was grim. I do not know, but I do not think it is out of kindness. Margaret found Edmund in the library 2 nights later, surrounded by ledgers of his own, his sleeves rolled up and his hair falling loose over his forehead, in a way that reminded her of the man she had met in the bookshop, before any of this began. The estate's income from the northern properties has fallen again, he said without looking up. If it continues, I may have to sell the shipping contracts my father held on the coast. Margaret's breath caught. The coast. Her father's old trade routes had run through those same waters, years before Edmund's family had ever touched them. Which routes? She asked. He glanced up, surprised by the sharpness in her voice. The southern passage, mostly. Why? My father used those waters. Edmund, before everything fell apart for him. He set down his pen slowly. I did not know that. There is a great deal you do not know about my father, because I have never let myself say it aloud. She sat across from him, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Everyone believed he lost his fortune through carelessness. That is the story his creditors told, and it is the story I let stand, because contradicting it required proof I did not have at the time. And now I am not so certain the story was ever true. She told him what she had never told anyone outside her own memory, that in the final year before her father's death, strange debts appeared in his ledgers that he swore he had never signed for, and unfamiliar names began attaching themselves to contracts he did not remember making. He had died before he could clear his name, and Margaret, only 19 and utterly alone, had not had the resources to fight men far more powerful than herself. Edmund reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he had touched her, in front of an open door in weeks. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because I did not want you to marry me out of pity for a ruined family," she said. "I wanted you to marry me because you loved me." "I did marry you because I loved you," he said. "I still do. Every single day that I do not say so out loud feels like a theft, Margaret. A theft from you and from myself." For a moment, in the low candlelight of the library, it felt almost possible to believe the waiting was nearly over. Then a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside, and both of them turned toward the sound, and the moment folded itself shut again, like a letter no one dared to finish reading. It was Margaret herself, 3 days later, who discovered the connection that would change everything. Searching the estate's old records for anything related to the southern shipping routes, she found a bundle of correspondence, tucked behind a false panel in the estate's records room, a hiding place Ruth had once shown her out of habit, rather than suspicion. The letters were old, faded, and addressed to Edmund's father, the previous Duke. They detailed an arrangement with a merchant family along the southern coast, an arrangement that involved forged contracts designed to push smaller, independent traders out of business so that the larger shipping houses could absorb their routes at a fraction of their worth. One name appeared again and again in the correspondence: Whitmore. Margaret sat on the floor of the records room for a long time after that. The letters spread around her like fallen leaves, piecing together a truth that made her stomach twist with something between grief and fury. Her father had not been careless. He had been deliberately ruined, his debts forged, his contracts stolen, by a family that had needed his failure to secure their own rise. And Lady Constance Whitmore, the woman now living in Camden House with her trunks and her cold smile, was the daughter of that very family. Margaret did not go to Edmund immediately. She was afraid, not of him, but of what the truth might cost them both if she moved too quickly, without enough proof to stand against a woman as composed and well-connected as Constance. Instead, she copied every letter by hand, late into the night, hiding the copies inside the lining of an old traveling case Ruth kept for her. "You look like you have not slept," Ruth said one morning, setting down a tray Margaret barely touched. "I have not," Margaret admitted. "I found something, Ruth. Something that could clear my father's name. But it will also mean tearing down the woman currently sleeping 2 doors from the Duke's own chambers." Ruth's eyes widened. "Does His Grace know?" "Not yet. I need to be certain before I say a word. If I am wrong, or if I cannot prove it, she will use my accusation to destroy what little trust I have left in this house. And if you are right..." Margaret looked toward the window, where morning light was just beginning to touch the gardens Constance had already begun redesigning, as though the house already belonged to her. "If I am right, then everything she has built here is standing on a lie, and lies, Ruth, no matter how beautifully they are dressed, always eventually fall." The pressure Edmund had feared for months finally arrived in the form of a letter from the King's Court, delivered by a messenger in formal livery who waited in the front hall until it was answered. The letter was polite, almost gentle in its wording, but its meaning was unmistakable. The Crown wished to see the Dukedom of Camden secured by a proper marriage before the end of the season, given the sensitive political alliances the estate's shipping contracts represented. Constance, informed of the letter's arrival by a servant loyal to her, wasted no time presenting herself as the obvious solution. She appeared at dinner that evening, in a gown clearly chosen for the occasion, and steered the conversation, gently but firmly, toward the subject of duty, legacy, and the responsibilities a duke owed, not to his own heart, but to his name. "The court is not asking you to marry for love, Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth as poured cream. "They are asking you to marry for stability. I understand that far better than most women in London would." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I am aware of what is being asked of me, Lady Constance. Then you are also aware that delay only invites more scrutiny. Scrutiny of your finances, your household, even the people you keep close to you." Her eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward the doorway where Margaret stood with a stack of correspondence, present only because Edmund had asked her to bring it. Margaret felt the threat land, even though it wore no obvious shape. She kept her expression still and set the papers down without a word, though her pulse had climbed into her throat. Later that night, Edmund found her in the garden, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, staring at the dark shapes of the hedges Constance intended to have removed. "She is telling me, without saying it outright, that if I do not choose her, she will look more closely at you," Edmund said. "I do not know how much she suspects." "She suspects enough," Margaret said. "I believe she has suspected for weeks. Then we are running out of time to decide how this ends." He took her hands, his own trembling slightly in the cold air. "Margaret, I could announce our marriage tonight. I could end all of this uncertainty in a single sentence, and risk the estate, the tenants, everything you have spent months trying to protect, on a night when you are not prepared, and she is watching for exactly this kind of mistake?" Margaret shook her head. "No, if we do this, we do it when we can prove not only that I am your wife, but that Constance Whitmore has no right to stand in judgment of anyone. Then we need proof before the grand winter gala. That is when the court expects an announcement." Margaret thought of the letters hidden in the traveling case, the names, the dates, the forged contracts. "I may already have more proof than either of us realized, Edmund. I simply need a little more time to be certain it cannot be denied." The final piece of the puzzle arrived, not through searching, but through memory. Margaret had kept, since her father's death, a small wooden box containing the last of his personal papers, items too painful for her to examine closely until now. Sitting alone in her room, she opened it for the first time in nearly 3 years. Inside, beneath old letters and a faded photograph of her mother, she found her father's private journal, its pages brittle but legible. In his own hand, dated in the final months of his life, he had written about a merchant named Whitmore, who had approached him with an offer to combine their shipping interests, an offer her father had refused, sensing something dishonest in the arrangement. Weeks later, the forged debts began to appear. Reading her father's words, Margaret finally understood the full shape of what had happened to him. He had refused to be part of a fraud, and he had been destroyed for it, quietly, efficiently, by a family who could not tolerate a witness to their methods. She brought the journal, along with the letters from the records room, to Edmund the next morning. He read through them at his desk, in near silence, his expression growing darker with every page. "This is not simply gossip or suspicion," he said finally. "This is enough to bring formal charges, if handled correctly. It is also enough to explain why my father died believing himself a failure, when in truth, he was a man who refused to cheat another family out of their livelihood," Margaret said, her voice unsteady. "I want the world to know that, Edmund, not just for my sake, but for his." Edmund closed the journal gently, as though it were something sacred. "Then we will make certain the world knows both truths at once, that you are my wife, and that your father was an honest man, wronged by people who are still trying to profit from that same dishonesty today." For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to feel something close to hope, fragile, but real, like the first warmth of a fire, only just catching. Invitations for the grand winter gala went out within days, addressed to every notable family in London, each one signed personally by the Duke of Camden. It was, by tradition, the event where important announcements were made, engagements confirmed, and futures decided in front of witnesses too numerous and too influential to be denied afterward. Constance treated the invitation as confirmation of her own expectations. She began referring to herself, in careful, indirect ways, as though her position beside Edmund was already settled. She ordered a gown from the finest dressmaker in the city and made certain the household staff understood that the evening's arrangements should reflect her taste. "You should not attend," she told Margaret one afternoon, finding her in the hallway near the ballroom being prepared for the event. "Household staff are not expected at the gala, and I would not want you to feel out of place among guests so far above your circumstances." "I have duties that evening," Margaret said simply, though her heart was pounding. Constance's smile did not waver, but her eyes turned sharp. "Duties? Yes, I am certain you have grown quite accustomed to duties in this house, Margaret. Tell me, does it not tire you, working so hard to remain so close to a family you can never truly belong to?" "I belong exactly where I am meant to be, my lady. We shall see." The Constance's voice dropped lower, almost gentle, which made it more unsettling than any shout could have been. "If you are hiding something in this house, I promise you, I will find it before the night is finished. And if you are indeed as attached to the Duke as the staff seem to whisper, I would advise you to remember your place before I am forced to remind you of it in front of everyone." That evening, Margaret told Edmund what Constance had said, word for word. He listened with a stillness that frightened her slightly, the stillness of a man deciding, finally and completely, how far he was willing to go to protect what mattered most to him. "She wants a confrontation," he said. "Then she will have one, but it will not end the way she expects." In the days before the gala, Margaret worked with a focus she had not known she possessed. She organized the letters, the journal, and the forged contracts into a clear and undeniable account, cross-referencing dates and names until even a stranger, unfamiliar with shipping law, could follow the thread from her father's ruin to the Whitmore family's rise. Ruth helped her copy the most important documents twice, once for Edmund to keep in his private study, and once for Margaret to carry with her on the night of the gala itself, tucked into a small case she intended to keep close at all times. "You are shaking," Ruth said, watching her hands as she sealed the second copy. "I am not shaking from fear," Margaret said, though it was not entirely true. "I am shaking because for 2 years I have waited for a moment to simply exist without hiding, and now that it is nearly here, I am terrified of losing it before I even have the chance to hold it." "You will not lose it," Ruth said firmly. "You have spent your whole life being underestimated, Margaret. Tonight, that is going to work entirely in your favor." Edmund came to her that final evening before the gala, dressed already in the formal coat he would wear the following night, as though rehearsing the moment in his mind. He held her face gently in both hands. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I am done waiting," he said. "I should have said it the day my mother passed, but I was afraid, and my fear cost you 2 years you did not deserve to lose. I will not let fear cost us anything else." "Edmund," Margaret said softly, "I did not marry a perfect man. I married a man who was learning, the same as I was. I forgive the waiting. I only ask that tomorrow you let the waiting finally end." He kissed her then, slowly, the kind of kiss that carried 2 years of held breath inside it, and for a while neither of them spoke of gowns, or ledgers, or gala guests at all. There was only the quiet certainty that whatever the ballroom held the next evening, they would face it together, finally, without a door between them. The grand winter gala filled Camden House with more light and more people than it had seen in years. Chandeliers blazed above a floor crowded with silk and jewels, and the air carried the mingled scent of candle wax, roses, and quiet ambition. Margaret arrived, not through the servants' passage, as she had for 2 years, but through the front entrance. Dressed in a deep blue gown Ruth had helped her finish just hours before, the same shade Margaret had worn the very first day she met Edmund in that rain-soaked bookshop. She carried the small case of documents pressed against her side like armor. Constance found her near the grand staircase, before Margaret had taken more than a dozen steps into the ballroom, flanked by 2 of her closest allies among the assembled guests, clearly positioned for an audience. "How bold of you to attend after all," Constance said, loud enough for nearby guests to turn and listen. "Tell me, Margaret, what exactly is your relationship to this household, that you feel entitled to walk among guests, as though you were one of them?" The room's attention gathered like a held breath. Margaret felt her pulse pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I am exactly who I have always been, my lady. A servant playing dress-up, perhaps," Constance said, stepping closer, her voice sharpening. "Or perhaps something more foolish. I have heard whispers, you know, of a secret marriage hiding somewhere in this very house. If you are truly the Duke's wife, as some have dared to suggest, then show us. Show this room some proof, or admit, finally, that you are nothing more than a woman who mistook proximity for love." The ballroom fell into a silence, so complete that the orchestra itself seemed to hesitate mid-note. Every eye turned toward Margaret, waiting for her to shrink, to stammer, to disappear the way she had disappeared behind doors for 2 long years. Instead, Edmund's voice cut through the silence first, rising clear and unshaken from across the room as he crossed the floor toward them without hesitation. "She does not need to show anyone anything, Lady Constance. I will." He reached Margaret's side and took her hand in front of every guest in the room, raising it and pressing a kiss to her knuckles with the same reverence he had shown her on their secret wedding day. "This woman is not a servant, and she is not a mistake. She is my wife. She has been my wife for 2 years, and I have waited far too long, out of fear rather than shame, to say so in front of the people who should have known from the beginning. She is not merely my Duchess by title. She is the reason this house, and this family, still stands at all." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Edmund was not finished. He turned toward Constance, whose composed expression had begun, for the first time, to crack. "And since you are so concerned with proof, Lady Constance, let us speak plainly of proof tonight." He gestured, and a footman stepped forward, carrying a folder Margaret recognized instantly. "It seems your family's fortune was not built on shipping expertise alone, but on forged debts and stolen contracts, taken from honest traders along the southern coast, including the father of the very woman you just tried to humiliate, in front of 200 witnesses." Constance's allies stepped back from her, instinctively, the way people step back from a fire they had not realized was already burning. "This is absurd," Constance said, though her voice had lost its polish. "Fabrications, designed to distract from." "Designed by whom?" Edmund asked calmly. "Because the handwriting in these letters matches your late father's correspondence perfectly, and the dates align precisely with the collapse of Margaret's father's trade. I would be very careful, my lady, about which family's honesty you choose to question in this room tonight." The silence that followed was different from the first. It was the silence of an entire room, recalculating everything it thought it understood, watching a woman who had spent 2 years unseen finally become impossible to ignore. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "My father died believing he had failed his family through carelessness. He did not fail through carelessness. He failed because he refused to participate in a fraud, and he paid for that honesty with everything he had. I do not say this tonight for revenge, Lady Constance. I say it because he deserves, at last, to be remembered truthfully." Later, when the gossip had quieted into low murmurs, and the orchestra had cautiously resumed, Edmund led Margaret onto the floor, for the first dance either of them had ever shared in public. Around them, The same guests who had questioned her an hour earlier now watched with a very different kind of attention. Some curious, some ashamed, a few even smiling. 2 years, Margaret said softly, resting her head near his shoulder as they turned slowly beneath the chandeliers. 2 years too long, Edmund agreed. But not one more day, Margaret. Not one more hour, hidden behind a door that was never truly yours to hide behind. Lady Constance Whitmore left Camden House before dawn the next morning, her trunks packed hastily, her invitations to London's finest homes already quietly withdrawn as word spread of her family's true history. She was not formally punished, not in a court of law, but in the only court that had ever truly mattered to her, the court of society's opinion. She had already lost everything she came to Camden House to win. Margaret, meanwhile, woke the next morning in a bedroom she no longer needed to sneak into, beside a husband she no longer needed to hide, in a house that finally, fully, felt like her own. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this. A person's worth is never decided by the room they are allowed to stand in, or the title people choose to withhold from them. It is decided by the quiet honesty they carry, even when no one else is watching, and even when the truth takes years longer to surface than it should. Margaret's father lost everything because he refused to cheat another family. Margaret herself waited 2 years in the shadows, never once betraying the man she loved, even when silence cost her dearly. In the end, the very same patience and integrity that made others underestimate her became the proof that finally set her free. If you enjoyed tonight's story, subscribe to see how many more journeys like Margaret's are still waiting to unfold on this channel, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. I would truly love to say hello to you, and to know just how far our story has traveled to reach you.